Welcome aboard, everyone that's here. Today, we're talking with Negarra Kudumu, and she's the manager of public programs at the Fry Art Museum, but is also an independent scholar and a writer and a healer that's working at the intersection of art and I'm going to talk to her about a number of those things, and you can all ask questions. And I interviewed her once before, so I have a sense of where she was last year, but I imagine things are quite different this year. So, Nagara, first, I just want to thank you for talking with us today. Thank you for being here.
No problem. Thank you for having me. I was super excited to receive the invitation, and also looking forward to seeing more of what you're doing with the Praxis Center. So thank you so much.
So let's begin with what's happening now. I mean, as you're saying, we're right in the middle of the reopening. You're in Seattle. Uh, I want to talk about healing and the intersection and a variety of things, as well as your training. But what's
Mhm.
happening at the Fry Art Museum in terms of what you're working on right now? Is there something at the moment um, that you're dealing with at the Fry Art Museum? Maybe we should just begin there.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting moment, as I'm sure you know, for the art world and for museums. At the Fry has been closed to the public since the first week of March. Seattle was one of the cities that quarantined pretty early. And due to there being so many tech companies here and there being a culture of tech here, um, thankfully, a lot of companies, even if they were not hardcore tech companies, but sort of had that culture, um, quarantined and were able to support their employees through remote working. And so I had been home, working from home since March, due to various reasons, but I would say most starkly the economic realities and impacts of the quarantine. The Fry made the decision to implement a company-wide furlough. And so for the months of July and August, the staff will be furloughed in varying formulations. And so I am obviously, as given I'm still employed at the Art Museum for this July and August period, I will be furloughed as well. And so what I was doing before the furlough was really just trying to get onboarded and moving with transitioning our once in-person programs to virtual formats to the best of our ability. Basically learning which ones were able to be transitioned and which ones were not so easily. And then also thinking about virtual only programming that we could do over the course of the summer, taking us into the fall. And then really also thinking about what 2021 is going to be like. For people who are familiar with museum work, you know that you're sort of always hopefully working at least 6 months to a year in advance for planning programming. And where exhibitions are concerned, you are working oftentimes 12 to 18 months in advance, if not more than that, depending on the size of the museum. And so this would have been the time that we were finalizing programming for January through March next year, but all of that is on hold because of the impact that the pandemic and the quarantine have had.
So there aren't virtual programs that you were talking about. You were transitioning to virtual programs, but that transition wasn't implemented yet.
No, it was implemented for the programs that we found were that we could transition into. Not everything we do is easily transitioned from in person to virtual. And so, for example, the mindfulness meditation program that we have, I'm really thankful that we were able to work with individual by the name of Christopher Rhodes, who is associated with the University of Washington Medical Center, who has been practicing mindfulness in a personal capacity for decades, but also incorporates it into his practice. And so he was more than willing to jump in and transition into the virtual. And so we have several mindfulness sessions that Chris conducted that are up on the Fry YouTube and have been promoted through our blog. Our standard September through June lecture series hosted by a woman by the name of Rebecca Albiani, we were able to pretty quickly transition that into a virtual only series. And then both curatorial and public programs came up with an idea of sort of a virtual visit. And so for curatorial, it'll be a virtual studio visit with artists. From my standpoint, it was a virtual visit, not just with artists, but also with curators, scholars. The most recent person that I spoke with is actually an artist, but also an architect as well. So taking individuals, some of whom are in Seattle, other of whom are working nationally, and eventually when we resume it internationally, and really learning about their practice, learning about the ways specifically in which the quarantine has impacted their practice, the conversations that they're having with their colleagues about what things are looking like, what things may look like in a quote unquote post-corona environment. Who knows if we're gonna even have a post-corona environment? That has been one very sort of interesting question and interesting conversation that I've been having. But
which means what exactly? Will we have a post-corona environment?
So I'm glad you asked. Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. So in the questions that I was posing to my invited guests, is I was sort of asking them to think predictively if they felt comfortable doing so. You know, we are still in, some places are still quarantining, some places are going back into quarantine. Depending on what news you look at, it suggests that places may be re-experiencing a second lockdown come fall. And so that question went from my presumption of there being an actual post-corona environment versus what seems to be more in alignment with the reality that we will be dealing with this corona environment for quite some time, and the post is quite further off than we anticipated.
So let's talk about.
Please.
Yeah, no. Yeah, so I want to talk about your healing practice and also how that might contribute to the conversation you're talking about right now. But Palo Mayombe is one of the traditions that you were trained in. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I know there's a number of people here, or many, that are interested in that aspect of your practice. So maybe just to begin with, you have a dual practice, right? You're a scholar, you're a writer, you're a curator, but also a healer. You work with individuals and groups. So to begin with, can you tell us a little bit about that and perhaps what the Palo Mayombe spiritual tradition is?
Yeah, happily. So Palo Mayombe is an Afro-Cuban spiritual tradition that was developed during colonialism, during slavery on the island of Cuba. It is an amalgam of various spiritual traditions of various Bantu ethnic groups from West Central Africa. And so geographically, we're talking about places such as from sort of the southern area of Gabon, going down the Atlantic coast to the northern region of Angola, and then sort of as far inward as I would say probably Zambia. And so the various African ethnic groups from those geographies who were enslaved and brought to Cuba, as well as various other places. But in Cuba, the tradition as it reformulated was called Palo Mayombe. And it is, amongst other things, amongst many things, I should say, a healing tradition. I think it's also appropriate to call it a liberation cult. It is a tradition that was formed in, contextualized by the inhumane, torturous conditions of colonialism and enslavement on the island of Cuba at that time. Africans from Bantu areas of the African continent arrived to Cuba as early as the, I would say, late 16th, early 17th century. Palo Mayombe, as it is practiced contemporarily, was not formalized until much later, but there were various kinds of spiritual practices present and practiced by those individuals from
Mm-hmm.
moment until the present day.
So how are you using that tradition with that training? You're using it with individuals for healing purposes. Can you
Right.
explain a little bit how that works and how that's different from Western forms we know, like therapy and talk therapy and psychotherapy and other forms?
So the one important thing to understand about Palo Mayombe and other kinds of indigenous traditions, but obviously speaking from this perspective, is that it's a nature-based tradition. Above all, we are constantly in interaction with the brute forces of nature. These are not entities that have ever lived as human at any point in time. There is also a heavy ancestor veneration practice within that. And so in my work, I work with individuals one-on-one. I have a teaching component as well as a coaching component. In the teaching component, I am not teaching the religion because the religion as such was and still is in large degree a secret society. And so the teaching that happens is very much within the context and for initiated persons only. So the teaching that I do is really drawing from those histories and certain of those practices and helping people to establish a foundation upon which they can build an ancestor veneration practice. And ancestor veneration is a core part of Palo Mayombe, but that aside, it is something that anyone can do and has the right to do independent of any spiritual tradition they ascribe to do. And so my teaching component of my business is very much around teaching ancestral veneration, like sort of the mechanics of it, giving history and cultural context from an African and African diasporic centered viewpoint on how that can be done, why it is that we do that, understanding the energies and the forces that we're working with, understanding how herbalism plays a part into that, and really teaching people how to build a practice or to reinforce the practice that they already have. In my coaching modality, I'm really working with individuals to help them get on a healing trajectory. And so it is never the objective that after 4 or 8 sessions with me, they will be completely and totally healed. The objective is that as they work with me, they are able to begin to identify and prioritize what it is that they want to work on, and to be able to leverage a spiritual foundation and spiritual concepts in the service of that, but then also begin to develop intellectual and emotional resources for tackling the issue and carrying them forward. And so we don't seek to cope. This is nothing that I teach or that I do is about coping with our traumas or with our problems. It is really about a deep understanding of that. But after achieving that understanding, looking at the ways in which one can develop tools that will allow them to become the primary agent in their healing.
And that and ancestral veneration is part of that.
It correct? Is ultimately always part of that, because again, going back to the cultural context here, where African people of African descent are concerned, and where African and African rooted spiritual traditions are concerned, ancestors are sort of like the base level of understanding and practice that one needs to have in order to move forward. And I think if you start to look at sort of any indigenous practice, particularly if you're looking at indigenous people of the Caribbean and Latin America, even of North America, even if you start to look at the indigenous pre-Christian European groups, you find nature-based traditions that had a heavy ancestral veneration, a significant, I should say, ancestral veneration practice. And so that really is the foundation of what it is that I do in my private client coaching practice, but also, really reinforcing and constantly thinking about practices and exercises that are practical, things that people can do on their own, things that people are not going to require any sort of codependence on me to move themselves forward.
Right, and ancestral veneration sounds so fascinating to me. And will this work with anybody? Is it a very specific area for people of African descent, or can ancestral veneration work with anyone from any background, geography, or otherwise?
Well, I mean, I think simply put, everyone has ancestors. If you have a relative that died, you have an ancestor. I work from this standpoint because it's what I'm trained in, and that is the modality that I use to inform my practice. But certainly I have clients of all different backgrounds. Some of my earliest clients have been Filipino, white. I've worked with Latino individuals. I have worked with all sorts of, in terms where ethnicity and race is concerned, I've worked with a lot of different kinds of people. Certainly, the majority of my clients are African American or people of African descent. But where there is, to speak very plainly, where there is a dead person to be found, I am a person who can support you in understanding what that dead person is here to do for you, and how you can leverage that ancestor, as well as your other ancestors, in what can be a generative and additive spiritual practice.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to give you a few questions. Anne's asking something very interesting. She's asking how you got interested and involved in this practice initially, but also a more complex question, which is how does nature and the non-human figure into the liberation practice? How does nature and the non-human figure into the liberation practice?
Nature and the non-human. When you say non-human, as in like sort of these spiritual entities, that is that sort of what?
Let me give Anne the mic, and she can ask.
Oh, I'm interested in this idea of how, specifically looking at animals or even insects, things that are non-human, things that are, which could incorporate other parts of nature. So when I say nature, you think like often more like green things and animals and everything. When I say non-human, I'm thinking more about this idea of entities that are alive, but perhaps participating in a different way.
Right. I got you. I didn't want to presume. I just wanted to make sure I understood you. Thank you so much for explaining that. And so within Palomayombe, certainly we believe that every living thing has consciousness. And so plants have consciousness, insects have consciousness, animals have consciousness. Certainly it is a different consciousness than the one we have, but it is a consciousness nonetheless. And it is an energy that is to be respected, and to be engaged with rather than controlled. And so when one is going about doing work that involves plants, that may involve animals, as is the case in certain kinds of the work that is done in Palomayombe, there is a protocol where before you are even entering nature, entering the forest, you are literally asking license, asking permission to be in this place with them. You are saying certain prayers that relay certain kinds of messages of respect and partnership and engagement and equity, as you go and take plants from the forest, or on the occasions where animal sacrifice is involved. When you are sacrificing animal, there are very specific ways in which that is done, so that we are managing and engaging in those relationships with respect and with equity. And for everything that we take and that we sacrifice, there's a payment on our end that we have a protocol for carrying out.
And thank you for that. Another question from Jonathan is, have you worked with someone whose knowledge of their ancestry only goes back 2 generations or so? And if so, how would that affect your work with that individual? Does that limit it somehow if you're not really sure where your ancestry is after a few generations?
Well, I mean that's actually a common thing that happens. So many of us, independent of race, only have actual factual information about our families to a certain point. I mean, if I use myself as example, on my mother's side of the family, we can go back until the mid 19th century on one branch, and then we can go back a little bit further on the other branch to maybe the 18th century, the late 18th century. But on my father's side, we can only go back until the 19th century. And so part of what allows you to make a, just waiting for the plane to go.
That's okay.
Part of what allows you to make a deep dive is the practice of divination, in which mediumship is something that is features heavily.
Mediumship meaning what?
Mediumship means the use of the clair senses to experience and access bodies of information in other realms.
Well, that sounds very interesting. Can you expand on that a little bit? Because I think we'd all like more of that. There's a lot of artists here, and that of course sounds fascinating. Is that possible to summarize or explain? Because that's
well, yeah. I mean, mediumship is again, very plainly put, is the interaction with primarily humans that have crossed over, who have deceased. Sometimes these humans that you're dealing with are those that you are related to. Other times they are what we call spirit guides, individuals with whom you perhaps in a past life had a relationship with. And so I term that sort of a soul relation, right? And mediumship is the ability to communicate with those individuals through extrasensory perception. And so you will often hear terms like clairvoyance, clairsentience, claircognizance, and they are ways to explain seeing, knowing, feeling, hearing, things that are not, that go beyond the sensory set of our sort of basic 5 senses. And that features heavily in these kinds of traditions. It features very heavily.
And can that happen with just one other individual? Because of course that's a fascinating, that concept seems to relate to art making, really, in some regard, right? I mean, so maybe it's
completely and totally. I would say, I mean, judging by the artists that I have had the pleasure to engage with and work with, I would say, whether they acknowledge themselves as such or not, that they are all mediums of some sort. They are channeling and receiving information from a source that is beyond, and people phrase the language around that differently depending on their context and their cultural background. But certainly when I speak to particularly a group of artists that I'm very close with here in Seattle, but also in the conversations that I've had with artists operating in other places and from other places, I hear some of the same things, which, things like, I received this information, or this came to me in a dream, all of which signal to me an engagement in a realm or with entities or individuals that we would term spiritual, potentially, or that we would term spirits or ancestors. And again, depending on the cultural context, people may refer to them as angels. People may refer to them as saints. People may refer to them as Orisha, as Loa, as Inkisi, as the wording changes depending on the cultural context, but people have a name for what that is. And way more people do it than perhaps they talk about it publicly. But as someone, who for me, this is my bread and butter. This is what I do all the time. When I have these conversations, the key words hit my ear in a certain way. And so I know what it is that they're talking about, even if I were to start some sort of hardcore technical conversation with them about mediumship and spirits and dead people and all this, they might be like, I don't know what you're talking about. I just had a dream yesterday, But for me, it all falls, very broadly into a body of knowledge in which I'm actively involved. And certainly artists, in my estimation, are can be some of the most receptive people to that.
That makes sense, and it's such a simple way to put it, right? When artists are talking about I had a dream or I had this idea, it is a form of mediumship, essentially, as you're saying. Jonathan, one artist here, is saying, he's used mushrooms to access other realms. People talk about using ayahuasca. We've heard about this a lot from artists lately. Or I have. Are there any specific roads to specific areas in your practice to that mediumship? I mean, artists who even have this natural sense of mediumship are using other things to access what seem like realms that they couldn't have otherwise through ayahuasca or mushrooms or something like that. Does your practice have a specific road or path to get to that as people are using?
So within my practice, which is a diaspora practice, it is my belief, I have not yet been able to corroborate that fully with historical references, but it is my belief that the use of specific medicines such as mushrooms, such as ayahuasca, did not make it to the diaspora in the same way. Within Palo Mayombe and within other spiritual traditions that you find in Cuba, but other places in the Caribbean as well, and Latin America as well, and certainly here in the United States, there is within the herbalism, there are definitely plants that can heighten one's ability to receive messages, whether used internally or externally. But nothing as singular that I have seen yet as ayahuasca or psilocybin mushrooms. That said, I do know a lot of practitioners in these traditions who have done plant journeys with ayahuasca, with mushrooms, specific to the region that sort of holds the antecedent roots to Palo Mayombe. There is a medicine called Iboga, also known as Ibogaine. It is indigenous to Gabon and the present-day Democratic Republic of Congo, present-day Republic of Congo. And it is, as I have read, similar in effect to ayahuasca. It is still used within the spiritual ceremonies of and I'm forgetting the name of the people, but if you Google Iboga, and Gabon, it will come up. It is still used within the initiatory traditions of this ethnic group, this Gabonese ethnic group. And I think that is how, probably within the past 20 years, it has gained in popularity with individuals going to sort of study this particular group of people, but in their spiritual practices and learning about Iboga. There is a organization in Portugal, if I remember correctly, not too far outside of Lisbon, that administers Iboga both for spiritual and personal development purposes, but also for individuals who are suffering from addiction and other conditions. It is illegal here in the United States, unsurprisingly, but it is certainly a medicine that interests me. And certainly if I have the opportunity, it's something that I would love to engage in.
Thank you. There's two questions here that I think could really come together. We're both asking about the future now, because in this moment of John's asking about it, and also another person about in the moment of planetary reckoning and social uprising, can ancestral veneration teach us to finally drop terms like the art world and see us all as one, or no? Do these traditions have a and he's speaking specifically, or she, of ancestral veneration? We're in an enormously tumultuous time. Is there a kind of larger healing we can speak of through these traditions, or this is really individual to individual?
So that's a really, really excellent question. And so specific to what I practice, it is a closed spiritual tradition. And that is because it is descendant of secret societies of varying kinds. And so while certainly anyone who's seeking healing from a practitioner of Palo Mayombe is not turned away, initiation is not for everyone. That is truly a calling. That said, I intentionally established my practice such that anyone who is able and can find me can seek the help that they need. I certainly believe, whether people start to do this individually or at a family level or at a community level, that a return to one's indigenous traditions. And so what I'm really saying when I say that, I mean sort of who we were before all of these sort of big categories like Black, white, all of that. I think that is something that is a more honest representation of who we really are, that has a capacity to really support us in healing, but also, support us in navigating the complexities of living life in an ever more complex world. The reason why I think that is because, again, so many of these traditions were and are nature-based, and we are in a moment where humans are literally ruining the earth. And so any consciousness that we can increase around how to engage equitably with the earth, how to do our part to support the earth in its regeneration processes, would be welcomed. And for me personally, I am all for individuals going about that task, as long as it is done so in a way that, again, is equitable with the earth, that is not extractive or subtractive, but that also is not predicated on the subjugation of anybody else.
That makes sense. And, where a number of people are asking, are talking among themselves about when these herbs are done and how they're used and different aspects of some of what you're saying. So, Anne's asking, can we bring some of these concepts into the classroom, into a more layman approach? Is it possible we can all get more involved with these kind of approaches, I guess is what she's saying, without getting so involved in the tradition or working? Is there a method? Because it seems that we all, maybe this isn't what Anne's speaking to directly, but it seems that we're all in need of certain types of healing now, where we're in such a difficult time on the planet that everybody has their own issues and things they're struggling with. How do we bring these concepts to help everyone without them seeing just you or other healers? Is there something that do you think we can or should be doing, in a sense that a layman could teach in a classroom, or that could be taught in a classroom in terms that that might be useful, or no? Does it not work that way?
Well, no, I think so. I mean, you don't have to you don't have to be a part of what it is that I do to understand healing, the necessity of healing, and the necessity of liberation. Like, I don't believe you need to at all do what it is that I do to believe or to know about that, or to be able to do it. Um, you know, my being a part of this was my decision, but as far as being a priestess in the tradition, an initiation is just that. It's a beginning. And so if I don't use my initiation as a toolkit and as a methodology and as an ideology to move me forward, it almost doesn't matter that I have it. It's about using it. And so when I think about lay people, it's a matter of educating yourself, finding the things that support what it is that you want to learn about, that support what it is that you want to heal from, understanding the ways in which many of the things that we've been taught and that we have just accepted have been problematic and have been antithetical to healing, and coming up with, being brave enough, I think, to introduce those in places, and with groups of people who are open to other forms of understanding and other forms of looking at the world. The teaching that I do is not for individuals who are already a part, is open to the public, is what I should say. It's not, you don't have to be a practitioner of an African or African rooted spiritual tradition. I have an individual in my member circle program who is part Dominican, but also is part Lebanese, and so she is completely and totally new to these things. There's some cultural competency there, but not necessarily to the degree that one might assume. And so it's really about giving people a building block so that they can begin to interpret and understand, and have their own conversations and see the confirmation as they begin to do the work.
That makes sense.
I hope that wasn't too abstract of a response.
I don't think so. Well, more people will ask, and we'll see. I'm going to put on Ivan now. He has a question to ask. Please. I think he's in Brooklyn. Okay. Oh, wait, sorry.
Okay.
Whoops. Now you're unmuted, I believe.
Checking 1 2 1 2. Am I on?
You are.
Okay. I just want to say thank you for channeling into this forum. I really appreciate it. It's such a breath of fresh air. I want to also say that nothing's too abstract for this forum. I think abstraction is a spiritual state of mind. I wanted to continue a little bit of the discussion that Brainerd very kindly opened up by referring my question to you earlier. I see the influence of Africa and its various regions as profoundly important for the healing of the whole planet. And what's happening right now with the coronavirus, global warming, recognition of police brutality across the planet, not just in the United States, but especially in the United States. And all these other concerns that are finally getting some fresh air, and people are rising to the occasion. And I see that possibly, and I want to kind of get your thoughts on this. How can we take the principles of healing as a fundamental aesthetic idea? Okay, the healing of individuals, the healing of the village, the healing of the community, and make that a central idea in the rest of the planet. My question earlier had to do with the art world, which I see as a conceptual descendant of monarchies, that somehow the the courtiers get to babble on and on about what fashions to wear and what to place on their walls, and it's a monarchic idea. It's a centralized aesthetic. But when you shift it to concern for the village and concern for the community, um, something happens. And I speak from experience because I was part of a scene in Williamsburg, Brooklyn called the Immersionists. In the 1990s, we were very community focused and we immersed ourselves in that very toxic environment. And we managed to energize the place considerably through a very interdisciplinary approach where art, politics, environmentalism, and just hanging out on door stoops became our aesthetic. And I see the African modality is very similar. And I want to just confess that one of the most potent parts of the scene in the immersionist world was to actually refute lock, stock, and barrel this notion of an art world, because it turned out at the time to be very practiced in Manhattan, but not in Brooklyn. And so I'm kind of wondering, is Africa Brooklyn? And can we join forces and say the art world is dissolved? And now we have the opportunity for a major planetary consciousness raising where healing of the whole village is the most important aesthetic idea.
I don't know that on even a national scale that would happen. And the reason why I am pessimistic about that is that there's way too much money caught up in the art world, and there's way too many people who benefit from it as it is. In the same way that these politicians and these, sort of policy people are going to do as much as they can to save our faltering economic system, because there's the stakes, to quote De La Soul, stakes is high, and so for me that is extremely idealistic. A good idea, a great one even, but extremely idealistic. I think you can have that kind of change when people are actually ready to talk about and then do paradigm change. You don't have that level of change until you have people, masses of people who are willing to talk about and then subsequently do paradigm change. I don't see that. What I do see is people in communities, within families, perhaps, several communities within cities who want to know more and want to learn more and want to implement those kinds of things amongst themselves. And I think more realistically, that is achievable at that level. And if it can be achievable at that level, then it can potentially spread. But I don't think that this is going to be done at the level that you're speaking about, universally or globally, until we are really done with this form of capitalism that we have now. And there are too many people in power who are not at all done with it. They like it the way it is. They profit from it. The art world in many ways can be seen as a microcosm of that. And I don't think that that's where it will go, or where the most potent change will happen first. I think the most potent change will happen first, and can happen first at the family and the community level, and then perhaps spread throughout locales from there. But I don't think that we are, as a global group of individuals, I don't think that there is enough consciousness to foment the kind of paradigm change that will be needed to topple the system that we have now, and then create something else that is equitable and that has an understanding of people first, healing first, partnership versus authoritarianism, if that makes any sense.
That does make sense. That's a tough system to get around. That's so true. And let me see. I think there's another question from Jonathan. Do you want to ask a question, Jonathan? I think he's at 1 second. You're not there yet. Okay.
I'm really not sure how I want to phrase this, because I understand what Negarra's talking about in terms of the fractiousness, but at the same time, I believe that what we are seeing right now is a whole bunch of parallel streams that are moving towards each other, and we can see this happening throughout the world, as in the Black Lives Matter movement is not owned by the Black Lives. If you look at the protests and the people who are supporting this, it is a very, very inclusive method of support. And I see, for instance, my own practice has left me out of the art world for a very, very long time. I am not a member of the art world. I am definitely an artist, and I believe that I am descended from shaman, and I also believe that art is what makes us human, and that the art world is very much, even though I want some of that money, it's very much a coffin that we are putting the spirit and life that art has originally given us. We go all the way back to Lascaux and before that. So I don't know, it wasn't really a question. It was me sort of rambling a little bit about the fact that I really think that actually this is the time that this is all happening. We're just in the middle of it, and it hurts like hell because, as one of the books that I appreciate says, pain is the touchstone of spiritual growth. Without everything breaking apart, without chaos, we can't have order and communication. And I see it happening in pieces, but people are coming together. And this is a fabulous time. I mean, this feels like hell, and it's a fabulous time. I don't know. Is there a question in there you can find?
I did not find a question, but much of what you said did resonate. And, the art world is an interesting place. It's an interesting place. I've been in it now since 2014, and specifically within museums, and then subsequent to that as an independent actor, writing, speaking about art, collaborating with artists. And, I wonder how all of this is going to pan out. I've been having ongoing conversations, with colleagues, and there was one conversation that was particularly poignant to me, particularly thinking about, museum closures, temporary or permanent. And the comment was, we do need art. We do need art. That's clear to me. However, we don't need to see art in museums. And so when you think about that, and particularly when you think very honestly about the history of museums, most places, it is a history predicated upon violence, capitalism, telling the story of the empire, which was an exploitative one, no matter how many stories of grandeur are contained therein. And I don't know that we need that anymore. We do need art, but I don't know that we need to see art in those kinds of spaces. And so thinking about that as someone who has been in a museum for going on 6 years, it'll be 6 years in October, how then do museums need to change how they function? Will museums within the next 10 years even become relevant, particularly as we move towards a state of environmental stress that may very well bring on additional pandemics, meaning that more quarantines and closures will happen, meaning that people won't be able to do sort of the core thing that people do, which is gather, which means people cannot go to museums. I, for one, am sick of looking at screens. I don't want to look at anything other than film on a screen. I don't want to look at paintings and sculpture on a screen. I also don't, however exaggerated this may sound, I also don't want to put my health at risk by going into a place where I do not have a clear read on the hygiene policies that the institution is implementing, and where I clearly can't control how other people conduct themselves in that regard. So for me, what does that mean? For me, that means more interactions with artists that I know on a one-to-one level in controlled environments where we feel comfortable doing so. And I'm thankful to have a growing group of artists with whom I have relationships of varying degrees of closeness, where that could be a thing, where that is a reality, and where it could be a reality where it is not currently. I also am fortunate enough, getting back to the question of galleries, which is another interesting sort of topic, I am also fortunate enough to have relationships with galleries who I think are doing good work and really supporting emerging artists, where I can continue to see art in those places. And so I really have been thinking, about what this quote unquote new way of life will mean for, museums, and how it is complicating an already complicated history, sort of parallel to the protests around the killing of, and sort of the ongoing killing of, young Black and Brown people. Have been conversations about equity within museums, which is, since social justice became in vogue where museums are concerned, has sort of just been the buzzword. And, there have been any number of meetings and thoughts and conversations about it. And, quite frankly, I don't know. I don't know. Yes, just off of just from the perspective that there should be equity in organizations, and from the perspective that organizations should treat their employees fairly. Yes, I wholeheartedly believe that these institutions need to be thinking about these things. However, do they need to be thinking about these things when the greater question is whether or not they will be able to persist?
That's very good. That's very well said. I think that the last several questions here, I think, touch on that and relate to, maybe expand on that. And this might be a good place to kind of finish up and close it, because a number of people are saying, can the museum definition be expanded? And I know you've had endless conversations with this about the museum, within your museum, but, museums, as Patricia's saying, is typically been a source to validate artists and their, and to put things in collections, and that it's a bit of a private club. And others are saying, like John and Anne, is there any conversation about the museum being a kind of a different form, like one on every corner, like some other form where artists are more involved on peer review panels? Is it possible, or is that even part of the conversation, that all these institutions, well, we're talking about museums in particular, could serve another purpose? Because as you're saying, the future for them right now doesn't look too optimistic. Is there any talk about another role that they can play within all of this, to be more inclusive, to be less clubby, to be less about capitalism and more about artists and community?
Well, again, to Jonathan's, no, it wasn't Jonathan who made that point. It was, who was it? Ebach, who made the point. And it was a very good one. Although, again, I reiterate that I'm particularly pessimistic about that. You know, museums, we have to accept, you know, and I say this, I guess, semi-cautiously, but we have to accept that museums have historically been where very wealthy people can put their money safely and keep it there. It doesn't mean that I don't like museums. I love museums. Some of my earliest memories, I'm from Chicago, or my mother taking me to the Art Institute of Chicago. You know, I really and truly enjoy museums. But we have to be honest with ourselves about how they work and why they continue to do the things that they do from an administrative standpoint. That said, where I find artists have the most support is where they are working as collectives, and when they can literally show up for each other in conversations about what an exhibition is going to look like, what programming is going to look like. And because of the sheer force of the numbers of them, and them all sort of being on the same page and functioning as a collective, they are able to get things done that potentially one artist, unless that artist happens to be a kind of established artist who's a darling, may not be able to do. A real life example that I have of that is a collective that I'm very fond of, and that with whom I've worked quite closely these past almost 7 years that I've been in Seattle, which is the Black Constellation Collective. There's something very special and very beautiful about the ways in which, whenever a subset or a one person has an exhibition or has a concert, or if they happen to be on tour passing through a city where there's a group of us that is present, we'll all show up in mass. We'll all show up in mass to support. And I have, but sort of because of my relationship to the Constellation, I have had the privilege of sort of working within that to a certain extent, but also being strategically on the outside of that. And it really changes the way in which the museum professionals with which we engage respond and function, because they're not just really engaging with the one of us who has the solo show, or the two or three of us that are performing at a venue, at a concert. They're really engaging with that collective energy, and whether they realize it or not, or whether they like it or not, they have other people that they sort of have to answer to in one way, shape, or form. And so what I see being more useful than perhaps trying to tear down a system that is designed to function the way that it functions, is artists among themselves. And artists have been doing this for decades. What I'm talking about is nothing new. There are collectives of artists who have been doing what it is that I've described for decades, long before I got into the art world. So I don't want to position this as something new that I'm talking about. But what I would like to see more of, particularly for however long this art world that we have is in existence is more of that, more artists working collectively, drawing upon the shared resources within their collectives, the shared knowledge, the shared networks, to make their show, their concert, their output the best possible that it can be. And having a support, most importantly, having a network of support that is experienced in the industry that they can call upon for advice on how to navigate some of these situations and engagements with museums and other art entities that want to show the artist, and in good faith want to show the artist, but don't always want the artist to show the work in the way in which the work was intended. You don't know how many times I've come across that particular scenario. And I find, and again, going back to the example of the Black constellation, that in the instances when we have moved as a collective and shown up to support the one individual whose show it was, or the few individuals whose concert it was, it really makes a difference. And it has been those instances where we have shown up for each other, where, quite frankly, has been some of the best presentation of the work that has come from the collective and has had some of the heaviest and most long-lasting impact. I think, and just quickly, I think that also can be applied commercially, where artists can come together, and for those who are not in galleries, do not want association with galleries, turning yourself into an LLC and being the arbiter and the salesperson for your own work. I'm under no illusions that it's easy, but I've seen it done. I don't think it's impossible.
I like that. That's ending on a bit of a paradigm shift note, because that would be a big shift were something like that to happen. Everyone's saying thanks so much, and we're also talking about Tears of the Art World and a number of things and healing. Is there anything else you want to say to as we end this meeting? This was a lot of people had a lot of questions and are very thankful for your talk. But anything you want to leave us on in terms of healing? That seems to be what's such a draw to how you're speaking and your posture.
Yeah, I think, and this for me applies to why I continue to have this crossroads practice, working at the intersection of art and healing. I really and truly think that when we are healing, we are maximizing our vitality. And art for centuries, millennia actually, has been a part of that. When you look certainly at African art, African antiquities, art was not a separate endeavor from sort of the rest of life. It happened as life happened, and it was done and happened in a communal way. And so whether you are dealing in healing or dealing in art, it is my hope that when we can start to prioritize vitality, and I don't necessarily mean exclusively material well-being, although yes, money is important and you need money to live, particularly in the world as it is currently formulated. But when you are seeking to maximize your vitality, inevitably you become clear on the things that are the antithesis of that. And so if we can all start to think about our vitality and what that means to us, what it is comprised of, and what we need to do to maintain it. For me, at this point, everything else sort of flows from that. If I am maximizing my vitality, that means I am working on the the issues that, you know, I need to heal. That means that I am being very selective about how I engage in energetically and with what. It means that I am maximizing my time with things and peoples and ideas and thoughts that are generative. In real time, that has meant during this pandemic that I have ingested less of the news, less of social media. And as much as I miss my friends, I have also been less on the screen, because that to me has been just very difficult. So that said, my ending note really is, we know that art and healing can contribute to a life full of vitality. And so if we lead from there, perhaps we can be more open to the specific ways in which we can achieve a higher level of vitality, starting with ourselves and then moving on to family, community level, and so on and so forth. Beyond that, if there's anyone who wants to reach out to me, my website is negarrakudumu.com. Feel free to contact me from there. Brainerd, thank you so much. This was really wonderful. A second wonderful chat under our belt. I really appreciate it.
You're so welcome, and I want to thank you, Negarra, so much for your time today, and then I want to thank everyone for their questions. A recording will be sent out where the whole chat will also be in there if someone's missing any of this. So, so again, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and I wish you well, and thanks everyone for attending as well.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Have a lovely start to your week. Have a good Sunday.
Thanks so much.
Bye.